and then I'm going to give a challenge to them after they share. I've done some study on the history of ordination because, to be honest with you, I looked at ordination and said, is this biblical? Is ordination biblical? Why? Because all of us are called to minister. All of us are ministers who have been set apart by God to the mission of God, that people would know the gospel, that they know who He is. Okay? So what does it mean to ordain people? Well, to put it very simply, to ordain, the way our tradition tells us, is essentially to set apart the equippers of the ministers. Not to set apart the ministers, but that the equippers of the ministers are set apart. And they're not set apart by us. We just acknowledge what God has set apart. Isn't that neat? It's all about the Lord. It's not about us. It's about the Lord. So what we do this morning is we'll be laying hands on three men. Art Boissiere, did I say your name right? Did I get it right? We've been practicing all morning. Art is the pastor of Kinsman Redeemer, which is a church that we are actually the mother church of, and we've been trying to encourage them. And so we're ordaining him to ministry this morning, to be a equipper of ministers. Adam Yaki, who most of you know, Adam is being ordained this morning as an elder of this church. We're going to be confirming in a couple of weeks during a prayer service. I think it's going to be powerful. We really wanted to give it special attention, not just in this section, but as an elder, but just take some time in prayer for our church as we transition. So he'll be ordained this morning, and William Grunewald, which we are excited about as well. I've known Will for a while. Very compassionate man. I love him. He loves outcasts. It's something I love about him. And so these guys will be coming up. They're going to share a little bit of their calling with you. But before we do that, I just wanted to share real briefly, again, what is ordination? Well, it comes from the New Testament where Paul and others laid hands on elders, not as a way of conferring some type of power, but as a way of affirming what God had already set apart. These were leaders, overseers, equippers of ministry in the New Testament. And they simply laid hands on them as a physical manifestation, kind of saying, God has set these folks apart to equip the ministers of the gospel. Well, if you look at the history of ordination, how did we get to where maybe some of you have experienced where it seems like it's kind of this, exclusive club where only certain people are allowed to do it based on who the church decides is ordained? How did we get to that point? Well, you'd be encouraged to know that Baptists have really kind of kicked against that and said, we don't really like that formal of an understanding of ordination. But in the New Testament, again, it was just a laying on of hands to say, we believe the Spirit has set you aside to oversee and equip the church. As the church began to grow, one of the problems that they had in the first century was it's not like they had a New Testament they could open up to and say, what does the New Testament say? They, of course, had the Old, but everything was kind of new, and they said, how do we now function? There was a real problem with doctrinal purity. And so what would happen is they would have these house churches in an area, these pastors of these house churches would then get together and form a council, and they would discuss issues of doctrine. Well, the council would then appoint someone who was a chair of that council for the area. And then that chair would then go to other areas and represent that group of people. Okay? Well, as time went by, again, because of this doctrinal purity issue, there became kind of a consolidation of power, a hierarchy, and this chair began to informally move into what would be called, in many circles, a bishop. Kind of like a pastor of pastors. And then as those bishops began to meet, who were chairs over certain areas, then they said, well, who should be the authority among us? Rather than working as a team, there became a more formalized hierarchy again. And eventually they began to discuss this idea of apostolic succession. Well, who was taught by whom? Those people have greater authority. And eventually this is what evolves into papal authority, the Pope. Okay? The bishop of bishops. A very well-defined hierarchy begins to develop for the purpose, at least initially, to purify doctrine. How do we keep doctrine from going absolutely crazy? This continued to evolve. It became more of a formalized position. They had many positions in the early Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal, in the early universal church, again, to protect doctrinal issues. As Rome adopted Christianity as its formal religion of choice, civil and religious authorities kind of began to blend together, and many of the pomp and circumstance of the Roman culture began to be confirmed onto the way in which they would affirm these pastors and bishops. So it became much more formal. And again, They didn't have the Scriptures, whereas we as Protestants would say, and we as Baptists would say, the Scriptures created us as a church. They began to think more of, well, we chose the books, and so we kind of like came before the Scriptures. And this authority began to be something that in the early church, it was like they were conferring this authority on those with whom they affirmed in ministry. It's like we're giving them that authority. I want to make it very clear that in the New Testament, the idea is that Paul lays hands on those that God has given this position to. The church does not give these men positions or authority. It's God's authority. All the authority we have is authority that God has given. I want to make that clear. A couple passages before we let them share. Galatians 1 is one where Paul points out that authority that God has given. Paul, an apostle, sent not from men or by a man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers and sisters with me. He starts out Galatians by saying, look, I want you to understand, God has given me this mission. Man did not give me this mission. I am ordained by God. Okay? But it also talks about the function of the church. In Ephesians 4, he says, now these are the gifts that Christ gave to the church, the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do His work and build up the church, the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son that we become mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Paul, again, wanted to make sure they were full in their maturity. How do we do that? By these leaders that God had set apart, not only by their gifts, but by their character as well, as we read in 1 Timothy a couple weeks ago. And so it's important that we understand this. The church does have a function in the laying on of hands to say, we affirm that God has given you a gift and a calling. We want to affirm that. We want to encourage you in that. So this morning is a morning of affirmation and encouragement, and make sure you understand the church gives nothing. God gives it. The church affirms it. Comes alongside these men. So, first, Adam and Yaki, would you come up and share? I've asked each of them to share a little bit of their calling, and then as they do that, we're going to come up, lay hands on them, and pray over them. All right?